Hi everyone, welcome back to War on the ISP. This is something of a grand finale of I think the major big videos and calls for resignations. So I'm going to circle back around today and focus on AEMO, the market operator. I know I mentioned them in my first Twitter video before I got hacked, and that's sort of what kicked off this kind of whole show, but I haven't really got started on the market operator story, and so this is going to really unpack that. It's going to be partly about Dan Westerman, but also a bit about the board too. I'm going to try to keep this in sort of two halves. The first one is the technical, what the ISP is now versus what it should be, and trying to show basically how its tunnel-visioned, slavish devotion to the assumption that all government policy is perfect prevents it from doing the things that it's required to do under statute. And that will also cause me to basically point out that I think that all the directors on the board of AEMO have failed in their statutory obligations as directors under the Corporations Act. And so that's the kind of what it is, what it should be, fairly technical, fairly cut and dried. This is where we're at sort of statement. And then after that, I want to continue with a bit of a second story, which is make this make sense. How the hell did we get here? Did all these organizations just want to and sign up voluntarily to become a protection racket for a defunct government narrative? No, there's a better story than that. Things happened that led them to get to this place. So I think that's a really important story to tell. So there is a lot to this. This is going to be probably a fairly long one, but I hope I cover everything. I'm sure I'll fumble and stumble at various points, but it's just so important that this story gets out there. It's told at least once properly enough to be known. So I'm pumped and excited to get it out there. First, I just want to say thanks as well to everyone that sent in messages. It's been truly heartwarming how many people have reached out to me to say that they completely support what I'm doing and to keep going and to keep fighting. So please keep them coming. The messages make a world of difference, particularly since I've deliberately sort of stayed off, haven't gained X account yet. Actually, there's some movement on that. I'm slightly optimistic that will take place, that I might get my account back. But it's just been great that everyone's reached out through email, through YouTube, through WhatsApp, through LinkedIn, whichever way you can contact me, and there's been such an outpouring of support. It's just been fantastic. This is my second take, by the way. So I finished, I sort of partway through my first take this morning, about 4 a.m, my toddler son woke up and desperately needed me, and so got up today and sort of tried to refresh myself. A couple of coffees, and let's just spill this out. Let's get it out there the best way I know how. So first, the ISP itself. I'm going to sit my my notes a little bit further up here. The ISP itself, it has become entirely dependent on the assumption that government policy is okay. Not just okay, essentially infallible is kind of the message here that we've got to. And so just to kind of, again, this is a point of fact that is not in dispute anymore. What's happened here is absolutely crystal clear. To quote from Daniel Westerman himself, all right, Daniel Westerman says, before a Senate committee on the Thursday, the 5th of December, the ISP is not a tool to evaluate government policy. It's a tool to say what needs to be delivered in order for that government policy to succeed. Again, there is no doubt about this. The ISP is completely focused simply on saying what it takes to make government policy happen. There is no way, therefore, that it is fit for any purpose that tests or evaluates or proves that policy is good in the first place. This is a disaster, right? But just to drill home the point, Eli Pack in a webinar sometime, this is in a CIS video if you want to look it up, has also confirmed that the decision was made to basically interpret all of government policy as a fixed and binding constraint on every scenario, right? All the scenarios that have any weight in the ISP. Because AEMO had decided, according to Eli Pack, that if they were to leave out some government policy or make it non-binding, that would reduce the likelihood of policy being met, potentially diverting investment away from achieving government policy. Now again, this is, I think, absolutely catastrophic for the ISP. For these organisations, the regulatory bodies, they must, in order to do anything useful regulatorily to try to protect consumers, they must be capable of pushing back. In fact, that's their duty. They have to be able to assess projects and say, yes, this one makes sense, this one does not. All right. So the fact that we've got to this point where AEMO themselves have declared we are not doing any testing of that government policy, we are just trying to bring it about, is absolutely catastrophic loss of independence and means the ISP is unfit for the purpose that it is trying to serve at the moment. Totally unfit. So let's go to this question of what should it be? If that's what it is, it's now just bringing government policy about without testing it. What should it be? And this requires a bit of a discussion and a trace through the letter of the law and the rules, which are the statutes that bring the ISP into being and give AEMO the responsibility and the powers to bring it about. All right, so we'll start at the top of the tree. I'm just going to spill through a few things here and explain various parts of this at the end to explain sort of the context. All right, so this is in the National Electricity Law, the highest level of statute that we have. Part 5, role of AEMO under the National Electricity Law, Division 1. 49, AEMO statutory functions in Part 2. In its role as National Transmission Planner, AEMO has the following functions. A, to prepare, maintain and publish a plan for the development of the national transmission grid. The National Transmission Network Development Plan, which is now the ISP, the Integrated System Plan, in accordance with the rules. Okay, law refers to the rules. And it also says that part 3 of that section, AEMO must, in carrying out the functions referred to in this section, have regard to the national electricity objective. All right, objective. This is what is good, is required, the law requires. Have regard to the objective. Objective is something that is legit and important. All right, let's continue on and go and have a look at what the rules say. All right, so the purpose of the ISP, this is 5.22.2, all right, okay, law requires the rules be followed. The purpose of the ISP is to establish a whole of system plan for the efficient development of the power system that achieves power system needs for a planning horizon of at least 20 years to contribute to the achievement of the national electricity objective. Again, there's the objective stated, special keyword that is important, that is legit, that has standing in the rules. Now, there's another little thing in the rules, which is I suppose it's a more minor part, but it's a key point to hang your hat on that is a specific requirement of AEMO that I think is absolutely essential in preparing the ISP, right? So this is 5.22.10, all right? In preparing an integrated system plan must, another point 5, consider the following matters. Point 2, the risk to consumers arising from uncertainty, including overinvestment, underinvestment, premature or overdue investment. That's crucial, and that's probably the one statutory obligation of AEMO that is most clearly, utterly and completely violated by this slavish assumption that 82% of renewable energy will be achieved at this point, because it necessarily railroads all our investment into a timetable that is divorced from reality, because that 82% is not going to happen. Absolutely not going to happen. I might elaborate on that more later. All right, so having established that, the law says follow the rules. Both the law and the rules say follow the objective. What is the objective? Let's have a little look at that. The national electricity objective is set out in the law. Okay, so it has standing. It had to get through Parliament. It had to be basically agreed to by the South Australian Parliament. Weird quirk of federation that's all done through the South Australian Parliament. But all the other kind of parliaments around the country have to sort of agree and support in principle through their ministers at least that this gets done. Right, now the National Electricity Objective, it now has 3 parts. I'm going to read the first 2, right? The first one, to promote efficient investment in and efficient operation and use of electricity services for the long-term interests of consumers of electricity with respect to, that's the lead-in, that's the header. Now part A. Price, quality, safety, reliability, and security of supply of electricity. Keyword there being supply. Now part B. the reliability, safety, and security of the national electricity system. Okay, key operative noun there being the system. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the moment because they're the first two national electricity objectives that have been with us for a while, and they're the vanilla ones. All right, we want it to be safe and reliable and secure, etc. And the first part also says we need the price. We want to have regard to getting the best price for the long-term interest of consumers. That's for the supply of electricity. Now, while some of those key words are the same in the second point, they focus on the system, all right? And I think it is relevant and important here to acknowledge there's a separate objective, which is to ensure reliability, safety, security of the system, which is not trying to optimize the price. That is a separate objective that we need to kind of consider in and of its own. Which means that it is, to some extent, in tension with the first one, which does include price, all right, for the supply of electricity. And that is good, and that's okay. And that is the nature of these electricity objectives, all right, is that they do have tension between them to some extent necessarily, but they're not too specific, all right? They don't spell out exactly all the implementation details, particularly numbers, particular dates. It's generally not numeric at all. These are high-level values that we have to keep in mind when we're doing the electricity system, without being too precise or prescriptive about exactly how that looks and what that embodies. Now, the third part is the inclusion of the emissions reduction component. Now, I'm going to spell this out properly, right? Because I am not opposed to the idea that reducing greenhouse gas emissions could be something that we include as an objective. And what it should have said is that Part C is reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. That would be great. That would be an objective that I think is excellent. There has been a foible, there has been an issue here in how this is worded, which I think is very bad, but still does not excuse what has happened and the necessity for resignations, because even what is enshrined here is absolutely terribly badly abused. But what Part C says here is not just for reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, but, and this is bad, this is consequential, this is where we run off the rails, the achievement of targets set by participating jurisdiction for reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, or, colon new line, part II, and this is even worse, that are likely to contribute to reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a key problem, because reducing greenhouse gas emissions is okay, that's good, it's a worthwhile objective. But what the third part of this national electricity objective has done is basically said we are going to not just make it a pure and simple value statement about emissions reductions, but make it the target statements that all the jurisdictions set, okay? Which in my mind opens the door to it becoming an extremely specific kind of numeric, lock yourself into a particular vision and road and target sort of thing, as opposed to the high-level principles that we want but need to continually evaluate and allow some room and discretion for the market bodies to keep all the costs and trade-offs on the tables, right? So that has kind of opened the door, I think, to a real problem where we now have basically politicians and their policy objectives being enshrined as being, you must follow my target, my particular target statement. Why is this still okay? And we sort of can work with this. And that is because of a key principle about these different objectives, which is that they basically all be considered in conjunction, all right? This is clearly stated in the second reading speech, okay? When this goes through Parliament, laws that are passed through Parliament, often they look to the speeches, or lawyers when interpreting look to the speeches about what their intention was to guide their interpretation. And so the second reading speech given by Attorney General Kaya Maher, right, for this introduction of this third objective, said that under this framework, decision makers under the national electricity laws will be obliged to consider the emission reduction component alongside the other components in making their decisions. In this way, the emissions reduction component is not intended to sit above or be prioritized over any other component in the objectives. That's key. That's absolutely key. I think it is suboptimal that they have made it the target statements and the things that might bring about emissions reductions, because they should have just left it emission reductions, in which case we'd be free to consider all the new things that might arise that could bring about emissions reductions, like nuclear energy, all right? But instead they have railroaded us towards the targets that are set by the governments that might help, which is essentially a way of locking us into a narrow path. But still, the saving grace is that they have said that these targets should not be given any kind of priority over and above the other objectives, which means we still need to be able to weigh up the compromise and the trade-off between all these things. And that is what the ISP has utterly, completely failed to do. By making all those policy targets binding constraints on every scenario, they have, to the most nth perfect degree possible, ensured that those targets are given priority and supersede, in effect, all the other ones. They are done first. Any effort to kind of consider the price, the lowest cost, is a secondary optimization that must fit within the bounds of first achieving all those targets. That's essentially the disaster. Now, I'm sorry, that's a little bit technical, but I think it's necessary to draw a very clear line between what is objectives, all right? Because we'd expect the government has a role in setting objectives, and they do, all right? Those objectives are enshrined in the National Electricity Law, all right? And the rules bind AEMO to consider them, all right? So the objectives are good, but policy, even though the objectives say that you should consider the targets of participating jurisdictions, making those overriding and supreme is fundamentally bad, all right? Because what it's essentially like is that instead of what the objectives should be, all right, I'm going to use a driving the car analogy, okay? Imagine you're a VIP, all right, which the governments might be. If you have a professional driver, all right, whose judgment and skill and care you trust, all right, what you do is you tell them the high level objective, all right, you declare what the rules of the road are and say these are my, obviously have to follow the rules of the road. You might also give them certain other value statements. Say, I want to minimize tolls, all right? Or I want to get there as soon as possible. Or you can say that I want both of those things as values, and if there needs to be a trade-off, please give me the options driver. But what you don't do is you reach over and have your hand on the wheel and say, no, let's go this way, that way, stop over here, go past this checkpoint. There needs to be a degree of separation between the supposedly independent, skilled, expert, technocratic body. They know the high-level objective, but then they are trusted with a degree of skill and expertise to be able to manage the trade-offs, calling out for specific guidance where required, but analyse and assess the route, the road, the traffic, and guide us there on a well-chosen path. And that has what has not happened here in the case of the ISP, because we have prioritised every whim and thought bubble and point and waypoint, this many gigawatts of that particular energy in this particular state by that time. All those things are set by governments. They're not passed by any parliament. They can simply be a thought bubble of the leading party that has government that day. There is no necessary test for any merit or suitability or harmoniousness or coherence with the rest of the policy objectives of the other states or the federal government. So by railroading us into every single policy in every scenario without applying any judgment about the optimality or cost or trade-offs between those objectives, the ISP is fundamentally not fit for purpose. So let's summarize the key core complaints and embodiments of how the ISP has failed, totally failed to meet the objectives, which include things like price, quality, reliability of electricity supply. The first one, as I've said, is the 82% renewable energy target, all right? This one drives the generation, right? It assumes that we can build an amount of generation in a timetable that is utterly unfeasible. Again, the workforce projections show that we'd have to double or triple certain parts of the workforce within a few years before those parts of the workforce later on then go and collapse, right? It just will not happen. It cannot physically happen. Even if all your legislative policy frameworks are perfect, no one pushes back, no legal issues whatsoever, no funding issues whatsoever, it just physically will not happen. Right? And this target, as I've said now publicly several times, it comes from Reputex. It comes from Labor's policy document that they commissioned from Reputex before they won office. All right. Now, Reputex said as an outcome of policy, right? 82% was not meant to be a policy. It was meant to be an outcome. Something would naturally flow from their policy to allow more capital at a lower cost to go towards transmission lines. A natural outcome of that was going to be that we hit 82% by 2030. Another outcome of that was going to be that we get $275 off our power bills by 2025. It's now 2025. And that latter is the total laughing stock of the energy policy debate. And yet somehow the 82% is elevated into the core, become a cornerstone of our most important planning document that can find no fault with that number and railroads us to assume that that is true. This is a disaster, right? So the generation is not going to work out. That generation simply won't be there in anything like the timetable expected. What else does a renewable energy power system need? Well, it needs a whole bunch of storage, all right? And the vast majority of the storage is basically just assumed into existence because it's owned by consumers. It's consumer-owned energy storage, right? Now, this, again, is an absolute disaster, a fatal flaw indeed. It's been pointed out by the Centre for Independent Studies and many other people through many different submissions and processes. But in the government's own commissioned report, which was finished by January 2024, well before the last ISP has come out, right, it says that, okay, and I'm just going to quote here a little bit to give you a sense of how clearly this is known that this is not going to work, right, that we cannot assume that this is a good choice, right? Quoting, the economic modelling process used to produce the ISP's ODP in optimal development path incorporates CER, consumer energy resources, and distributed resources as an exogenous variable. Based on stakeholder input and expert advice, the review considers that this is a limitation of the current ISP. And it goes on later, right? So modelling future CER investments in this way is unlikely to adequately consider the trade-offs between small-scale investments in CER against investments in other types of generation, storage, etc. Unlikely to adequately consider the trade-offs. That means this is not optimal, all right? Nothing that's done to test whether this is optimal, right? It says this is problematic from the perspective of the ISP's ongoing scope as a national transmission plan. This is in the government's own report. And again, it's toned down, it's kid glove language, but this is damning. The largest single part of the storage is problematic from the perspective of the ISP's ongoing scope as a national transmission plan. Truly damning. It doesn't assess the trade-offs properly. It is almost certainly not optimal, not even sure it's feasible. Right? What else does a renewable-dominated transmission and energy plan need? Well, it's also going to need some network, all right, to connect all these resources together, all right? Okay, now the distribution networks are the largest single part of the cost base for our bill system, and they're not included at all as a cost in the ISP. Again, okay, and again, quoting from this report, again, this has been raised by so many stakeholders. Again, the breach of trust is so severe. But in the government's own review that they commissioned, that they had read and good and ready 6 months before they published the last ISP, quoting, currently AEMO assumes that distribution networks will be appropriately augmented to facilitate the level of CER penetration and operation in any given planning scenario. However, whether DNSPs, that's distribution network service providers, will achieve those levels of growth through their annual plans is not specifically evaluated as part of the ISP. All the enabling network stuff that's in the distribution network, the biggest part of our bill, they have done nothing to check whether that's actually compatible with the assumptions they modeled in the ISP. Again, this is kid glove language. This is taming things down, right? This is the one the government could control, and they buried at the bottom of a drawer all year, why they launched the last ISP as though nothing was wrong. This is absolutely damning. Fatal flaws confirmed by the government's own review. And there's more, all right? So what is reliability fundamentally underpinned by in the ISP? Of course, there are days when the batteries run out, right? Those batteries that you've assumed into existence as an exogenous variable that's connected through all this distribution network that you haven't costed and wouldn't be upgraded, right? The final underwriting, if you assume that nothing else has gone wrong, the final underwriting of reliability of the system is provided by gas peaking, all right? Same damn review that the government had 6 months before the last ISP. All right, them describing the use of gas in this peaking function, this extremely intense exertion in those last few days of the year when you don't have enough wind and sun, all right? However, the cost of gas infrastructure investments that enable these assumptions are not integrated into the ISP. That is, the gas supply model validation provides some assurance that needed gas market outcomes are possible, but neither confirms nor ensures that these developments are least cost or that they contribute to a least cost energy transition. This means that gas developments needed to satisfy the ISP assumptions may not be likely or commercially feasible, meaning that AEMO is assuming gas will be available to service gas-fired power generation the gas market might not be able to deliver at the price or quality assumed. Boom, right? In case there was anything else that needed to be said about the ISP, the fundamental last backstop of reliability, right? The gas developments needed may not be likely or commercially feasible. That was known in the government's review, the government's own specially controlled, kid-gloved kind of, only talk to the experts you want to talk to review, 6 months before the release of the latest ISP. All right? And it's been confirmed as well, the Simshauser report that came out of Griffith University recently has sort of mapped in detail how many blackouts we would get if we carried on the way that we currently are planning. It's hard to describe the extent of the breach of trust that we now have from Daniel Westerman, okay? When that ISP was released, all right, in 2024, middle of 2024, in June, all right? I think on June 27th, there's a nice YouTube, little video pitch from his smiley face, all right? And a quote that's given in the description here that comes from the video is, as with previous reports, this plan shows that the lowest cost path for secure and reliable electricity is from renewable energy, connected with transmission and distribution, supported by batteries and pumped hydro, and backed up by gas power generation. And that's quoted everywhere. It's on the official YouTube, the official Facebook as well for AEMO. It's been quoted as well, that quote, in Utility magazine as well, online on the, where's the date here? 18th of December 2023. All right, so that's from the previous ISP, right? This is more or less the same quote that's popping up everywhere. So the CEO, Daniel Westerman, is flat out giving us assurances that this is least cost, that it is reliable. And he has in his possession, or at least the government has in their possession, a review of the ISP. You'd think it's been shared with the CEO of AEMO that says that none of that checks out. The trade-offs are not sufficiently evaluated. The assumptions are required to make the gas firming work or the distribution network work. None of that's been checked. I cannot describe the depth of scandal in this case, and I think it's clear. I'll just say it now, right? It is clear that trust in AEMO as an institution could not be rebuilt with Daniel Westerman at the helm. I think for the sake of AEMO, he should acknowledge how bad this now looks and step down. I think that is the very barest minimum that is necessary. But I want to make this specific as well and discuss what it means for directors, all right? So AEMO has a board of directors, all right? And it's been made very, very clear by both Daniel Westerman himself and also by Merrin York in answering questions before Parliament, right? So again, on the Thursday, 5th of December in the Senate, all right? In describing this, Westerman says, he's describing that is that we have conferred functions, these statutory obligations, so that we only do what is conferred upon us under the national electricity laws, rules and regulations, be that electricity or gas. It is our board of directors who are accountable for the delivery and performance of those functions. And I think you can check this out any which way through corporations law or the board charter or constitution, whatever else. But let's just take that as given. It's the board of directors who are responsible and accountable for ensuring that AEMO's statutory duties, upholding the national electricity objective, right, is discharged. And I simply cannot see how any of the board of directors are actually doing their director's duty properly and could be found under corporations law to have exercised due care and diligence or acted in good faith, right? These are corpse law things that they're required to do. So let me just call them out and name them, right? So Professor Mary O'Kane, all right, Julianne Alroe, Anne Nolan, Catherine Presser, Christine Williams, Ki Wong, Tony Concannon, Betsy Donaghy, Nino Ficker. All right? All of you guys, check your director's duties, check the national electricity objective. And here's a few specific questions that I think you need to answer. Did you know that 82% was going to be mandated as a binding constraint on every scenario in the ISP before the 2024 ISP? Do you still know that that's what they plan on doing again in the 2026 ISP? Have you considered your obligation to guard against under and over premature overdue investment, given that we've railroaded ourselves and assumed that we're going to have a timetable that is technically and physically infeasible on the blind assumption that government policy is met? Tell me how you're projecting consumers and their long-term interests while assuming that's the case. Another question for directors. Did you ask for or receive a copy of the review that the government commissioned and had ready by January 2024, 6 months before the ISP was released? Did you comprehend the significance of the way that CER was modelled? The failure to test and to simply assume that distribution networks would be upgraded to accommodate CER? Did you recognise what it would mean, that it would mean blackouts, given the backstop for reliability, which is gas? The assumptions required to deliver that peaking capacity were known not to be likely to be delivered or commercially feasible at that point. If you knew any of that stuff, how honestly were you discharging your director's duties to look after the long-term interests of consumers and ensure the national electricity objectives are held up? I can't see it. I absolutely can't see it. So certainly Westerman, at the very least, I think given he's been the mouthpiece, the spokesman, making so many misleading statements, has to go. But every one of the other directors, I don't know, I kind of want them to stick around. I want them to face the music. I want them to see an answer for what they've done. I want to see them explain. Did you know any of this stuff? Did you know what was going on in your name? Like this is just, I think, absolutely absurd and insane. All right. So by failing to point out the shortcomings, by failing to respond, by failing to adjust the ISP, and because there's things they could have done, right? They could have said, okay, let's cap the gas peaking we can have to a level that we're pretty sure that the current gas system could deliver on for their peaking capacity. Let's see how that looks. Let's put a binding constraint. Make that a scenario that is weighted with some likelihood. All right. Could have done that. Did they do that? No. Didn't think about that at all. Or what about they do for the consumer energy resources? And this is what's been done, by the way, and I think it's a sensible approach done in the Net Zero Australia report. Like let's not model any of those batteries as free. Let's just assume they're provided by grid scale batteries, which is probably cheaper, by the way. But let's just assume that amount of battery will have to be provided somehow and include that in the optimization. So that cost is not completely passed on to consumers in case it doesn't look optimal to have that amount of batteries. Did they do that? Anyone think about that? Apparently not. And there is no intention whatsoever. We're going to all the the ISP submissions and looking at what they're proposing and doing in the IASR, the Inputs and Assumptions Scenario Report. they're not going to change this at all. Right, so let's move on to that second stage. I'm just going to have a sip of my coffee and a sip of water. We've got to be thinking here, how did this happen? Aiden, make it make sense. How did all these people, did all these directors, did all these market bodies, did they deliberately just put their hands up to volunteer to become some kind of protection racket to make sure that nothing disturbed the government narrative, that every policy fantasy was totally indulged and never critiqued by AEMO using their independence and their technical skill? How does that ever happen? That's a good question. Just a second, I've got to turn on my air conditioner. It's starting to get really hot in here. One moment. I hope that is. I hope that's not too loud. But let's carry on. All right. This story has to be told. This is crucial, I think. And to try to tell this story, because all the people aren't evil. They're not just apparatchiks of the Labor Party. It's not they don't care about consumer interest or their sexual obligations. What's happened here is a tragedy, an absolute tragedy, and it's believable. And I think an analogy might be helpful to try to explain how we got to this sorry situation, right? So this is cheesy, this is fun, but bear with me. I watched this great, sort of fairly straightforward but really fun action thriller called Carry On. It's on Netflix at the moment. Taron Egerton, I think, guy acting it anyway. It's a story about this baggage, not a baggage handler, a security guy, a baggage checkpoint security guy at an airport, and he's a likable guy, but not amazing until he becomes James Bond at the end and saves the day and defuses the bomb and kills the baddies. But anyway, he's a kind of ordinary but decent guy, and anyway, in his job, he gets kind of hijacked and taken over because a nefarious organization gets some nasty, sophisticated spy-level enforcer group to slip him an earpiece, which he puts in, and immediately they declare that they're going to execute his pregnant girlfriend if he does not follow their every move. All right, does not follow the instructions and behave exactly according to the nefarious enforcer's wishes, to smuggle a bomb on a plane to blow up a plane for some reason. So, terrible spoiler, right? Sorry, spoiler alert. This was a fun film, but I'm going to spoil it all for you if you haven't seen it yet. And so the movie is fun because it goes through and sees this sort of nice, likable guy in all these kind of slightly odd situations where he does these things that are totally out of his character, right? So he gets his best mate fired from his job by slipping alcohol into his coffee and walked off so that he could take a certain spot to kind of get the bomb through the security at the right point in time, and right, totally out of character, and he turns up in these odd places with different people being like, explaining what is there, trying to basically, get the bomb through the things and follow the wills of the terrorist to save his girlfriend that's being threatened with murder. And so it's a fun film. Him being in weird situations, behaving strangely, totally out of character, because people don't know. All these people are saying, hey, you're acting weird here, right? Like, this is not you. There's something odd with you today, right? And it makes me think exactly of what myself and many others in the energy space, watching the last couple of years of all these market bodies, right, doing all these strange things, like making 82% a binding constraint in every scenario, tearing up the slow change scenario, which was the only reference point that was a kind of like, relatively unconstrained optimization, like, the market commission, right? This story kind of extends to all these guys. The market commission, right? Tearing up the terms of reference for their electricity price trends report, which is a fantastic, useful, important report, in order to make it this fluff piece that kind of just totally preens the feathers of the ISP and doubles down on all the worst assumptions of the ISP and makes that all seem more normal. All these things that you kind of like look at them and you say, what's with you today? Do you not want to do your actual job? Do you not want to actually protect consumers and be independent of government and apply some skill and technical expertise? All these kind of things, all right? And so I think it is more understandable. It's explainable now because I think that we've discovered the earpiece. We can see through the results of the last Senate inquiry, all right, which are underdigested probably by the senators actually themselves, in my opinion, right? This was cut short. It should have been like a 6 months to a year long. It was done in 3 months, if that, right? So, but we can now see a hint of this earpiece that is controlling. It's got into these people's ears and seemingly being able to push them around. What's the earpiece, Aidan? It is an organization called the Energy Advisory Panel. All right? The Energy Advisory Panel. Let me go and try to tell you, to explain what the Energy Advisory Panel is. In the words of the chair of the Energy Advisory Panel, who's Claire Savage, also currently chair of the Australian Energy Regulator. She gave this again in evidence to the Senate inquiry on the 5th of December. This is a sort of monumental day, right? So the EAP, I'll call it EAP, it is a coordination and advisory body that is accountable to energy ministers, all right? Okay, and get this one, it operates by the delegated authority of energy ministers and is accountable to energy ministers. Ponder that for a minute, right? The EAP has the heads of all these three market bodies sitting on them, all right? The supposedly independent statutory authorities, right? Chair of AEMO, not chair, the managing director of AEMO and the chair of the regulator and the chair of the market commission, right? And they are operating by the delegated authority of energy ministers. They're literally an extended arm of ministerial authority, all right? That is accountable to energy ministers to reach back and provide them, wait for it, totally confidential, untransparent advice. That's actually it. I'm not joking, right? So the EAP reports confidentially to the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council of Ministers. As a result, and to ensure we do not prejudice Commonwealth-state relations, we cannot discuss the advice we provide to the ECMC, the ministers, all right? So we have created here this body that is perfectly secret, no records kept, where basically these market body heads align themselves and put themselves in secret, close correspondence with ministers. And like there's more quotes here, and it looks like they're thoroughly enjoying it, or at least the chair is, right? So Senator Grogan is just an absolute standout. She's the most effective senator in this whole inquiry, in my opinion. She's for the government, all right? So she works for Labor, and at every possible turn, she tries to make out that these organisations are the most innocent and non-conspiratorial and completely well-justified organisations, and she ends up doing exactly the opposite and providing me all the evidence that I need, like better than anyone else in this committee, right? So she flushes out these incredible quotes from Ms. Savage that I think just make it so clear how the EAP has essentially become more or less a forum for alignment of the market bodies with their ministers, right? So she says, so Senator Grogan says, would you find you providing a useful coordination role in the energy system governance? And Ms. Savage says, I hope it's useful. From our perspective, we find the opportunity to come together and talk about the sorts of key policy issues that ministers might be considering useful. All right, and she goes on later. So it gives us an opportunity to consider what ministers currently have on their plates and look at our advice in that context. All right, so it's certainly useful to us, and we would hope useful to ministers as well. Again, this is from the current chair of this organisation. And later on as well, right? I think the Energy Advisory Panel is a forum for us to consider the broader issues that are in front of energy ministers. Okay? So Claire Savage at least is clearly lapping up this this role, seemingly, that is to kind of provide this to intimate, totally discreet connection with energy ministers and make their priorities sort of the first thing that the market body heads are providing. Now, I think it's absurd and ridiculous, but it gets even more absurd, right? Is that you'd think there would be some there would be some sort of official terms of reference, right? Given this is an extended arm of ministerial authority, right? Like, there would be kind of a terms of reference, all right? And it's claimed that there is, okay? So again, the Energy Advisory Panel, all right? So it's claimed by the chair that we have the AEP is underpinned by a charter and operating principles, all right? But yet that charter and operating principles is not forthcoming at all right? And in fact, it's requested, all right? So the chair of this committee has asked, what about EAP's terms of reference? All right, this is Chair Senator Van, all right? I think we, certainly this table, have all gone looking for them and haven't been able to find them. Are they available somewhere? Simple question. To the chair of the organisation, all right? To the chair, Ms. Savage, right? Well, we have terms of reference and operating charter, all right? Okay, before it was the operating charter and principles. Now she says there's terms of reference and operating charter. I'm not sure why they haven't been published. I think that's a question for the government. All right, interesting. Plot thickens, and the chair says, well, surely that would be normally available on the Department of Climate Change website, right? Or the Energy Climate Change Ministerial Council. Right? Obviously, yes, you'd think the ministers would have published the charter for the organisation they've set up to give them this close, intimate advice. No, there's none there. And the chair goes on to ask for these terms of reference to be provided on notice, and no. So Ms. Savage wiggles out of it. She says, I pretty much ran through them in my opening statement, all right? And so, but I think the decision to publish those documents would be a question for government. So you need to ask the Department of Climate Change and Energy on notice. By the way, this hasn't happened. They still haven't been provided. It was an official recommendation at the conclusion of inquiry that these should be provided. I actually, I'm not sure they actually exist. I'm not sure that the terms of reference actually exist. And the reason is, right, because Claire Savage, I've already called for her resignation for making statements before the Parliament that are lies, all right? Falsehoods that she could not possibly have known or thought were true at the time. And so I've kind of got a red flag over her anyway, but right, anyway, she's stated here to Senator Van that she's pretty much run through the terms of reference in her opening statement, and yet when making excuses before Senator Canavan earlier on as to why this committee, this group, this Energy Advisory Panel has not met and is not willing to discuss their group coordinated advice to government on the crisis that happened in New South Wales the week before, where there were almost blackouts, right? Ms. Savage says, our terms of reference are very clear, that we meet quarterly and that we meet in the lead up to an energy ministers meeting. All right. Now, I just don't buy that at all, because she said she went through the terms of reference in her opening statement, and there was no reference in the opening statement as to whether they meet quarterly. It was actually in response to a question that she says that, a question from, again, Senator Grogan, love her, in response to questions, we have been meeting roughly quarterly to essentially coordinate our advice to ministers ahead of the energy ministers meeting. At this point, I'm just willing to call it like I think this is made up. I think someone here is paddling furiously, trying to get out of a situation which is totally untenable, totally unviable. This has all been essentially made up. I don't think there is a terms of reference, an actual charter for this organisation. So again, it's improper. The secret earpiece, I don't think it's that weird or extreme. This organisation was meant to never be noticed, all right? I hadn't heard of it, by the way, before this Senate inquiry hearing came up. And other insiders that I know sort of said, and when they heard it was going to be called before the Senate inquiry, said, oh, it's actually met? Is it doing a thing? It's meant to be secret. No published terms of reference. I question whether they even exist. And yet here they are trying to explain that there's nothing unusual here, nothing going wrong. All right, Aidan. Make it make sense. How do you steal man? Where did this come from? Surely we didn't just have suddenly spur up this magical kind of totally secret, totally unaccountable, totally untransparent body of all three market body heads just completely in the throw of energy minister's most secret confidential policy advice forum that we never get to see or hear anything about. No, it didn't quite happen like that. There is a backstory as to how this occurred, and this is necessary to unpack and tell the story, right? So the EAP actually came from a different organisation called the Energy Security Board. All right, the Energy Security Board came before, and that was actually a recommendation that came out of the Finkel review. Okay, Finkel recommended there be an ESB set up. All right. The Energy Security Board certainly did have a substantial terms of reference. It's not written into law or rules, but it was an advisory body that had a lot of serious documentation around it. They had a website, they had a secretariat, they had a review commission of it, they had terms of reference that were at one point extended officially. The ESB is pretty legit, all right? It had a function, and its function was to coordinate and provide policy advice and policy development work, right? But to hear the story, again, best to hear it from the horse's mouth, because I couldn't really tell it any better. And again, Senator Grogan, thank you so much. Love your work, right? Thank you for coming and joining us this morning. You've just stepped out what the EAP is. Can you give me a quick rundown of what the difference between the EAP is and the ESB was? All right, so Ms. Savage then goes on to expand. Certainly, the ESB was constituted, as I said, in 2017 following the Finkel review. It had an independent chair and an independent deputy chair, both of which were in that capacity at least 3 days per week, 3 to 5 days, depending on that. Those were some committed resources to the ESB, along with the 3 heads of the market bodies. The ESB had a secretariat. It had staffing and resourcing that was provided from energy ministers to undertake policy development work. All right? And she goes on and expands on some examples of that policy development work. All right? Claire Savage goes on. The EAP is quite different. It is a continuation of the ESB, but we don't have any resourcing or funding. We don't have an independent chair or deputy chair. We don't have any ongoing FTE, full-time equivalent, support to support it, other than half an FTE the AER currently has to support the secretariat arrangements. All right, it goes on to say the comment will be meeting roughly quarterly. All right, I would say it's probably a lot less resource intensive than before, but that is in recognition of the fact that the National Energy Transformation Program, another word I'll explain later, had commenced in, I think, May 2023 and had effectively picked up that large policy development function, which is now dealt with via working groups, senior officials, and various jurisdictions. So you can see here what the chair of this organisation, who I think is being pretty dodgy with the truth about not having a charter or a terms of reference that she can actually provide to the Senate inquiry when asked for it. She's trying to make out here that this was a switch from a pretty heavy, quite official policy development organisation to a very, very light, just coordination and advice. Softly. And this switch happened in May 2023, along at the time of the National Energy Transformation Program. All right? And this is wrong. Let me just go on and expand how wrong this is. Because the National Energy Transformation Program basically kicked off before that. It was in 2022. In fact, on Friday, 28th October 2022, all right, it was it was in that one that under the actual new National Energy Transformation Program, the governments, the ministers listed out all these absolutely fantastic developments of pie-in-the-sky policy initiatives from all the different state governments, including things like these commitments to rewiring the nation, the VNI West, Marinus Link cables by 2031, Victorian offshore wind, battery of the nation, all these things that aren't, can't, won't, wouldn't happen, aren't economical. And then, all right, and again, I've mentioned this quote before, ministers tasked market bodies with taking all necessary measures to ensure the delivery of these nationally significant infrastructure projects, targets and plans within their specified timeframes. All right, that statement has been made, all right, 6 months before, more than 6 months before this May 2023 date. All right, so that program was well and truly underway. So something does not add up in Claire Savage's story here. So about 6 months earlier, that program kicked off, and that those senior officials and other people, it sounded like the work, the heavy lifting was given to other people, senior officials of various jurisdictions. Now, how else do we know that this is something is up here? Something is seriously wrong with the story that's been painted here by Claire Savage. And that's because Claire has this brilliant tell. I love it. She did it with Stephanie Jolie, and that's why I called for Stephanie Jolie's resignation as well, where at the exact moment when she's reeled off pure rubbish, all right, she's been caught red-handed with a total falsehood, been called out, checkmate, explain now, this thing is not that thing, explain yourself, and she starts to completely just twist and fumble any resemblant truth and pretty much lie. At that point previously, she leans over and says, unless Stephanie Jolie wants to clarify, right? And she does exactly the same thing here. Exactly the same thing. This perfect little tale of Claire Savage's. On Thursday, 5th of December 2024, she says, after that description of this switch that happened in May 2023, which actually was not, it was definitely October or August 2022, she says, that's probably the best description I can give, unless Anna or Daniel, and leans left and right to her other fellow travellers on this EAP, this Energy Advisory Panel, and Ms. Collier, all right, whose resignation I've already called for other reasons, all right, steps in and takes the bait. All right, and so Ms. Collier, the chair of the Australian Energy Market Commission, says this, it's probably also worth noting that there was an interim step. All right. Here we go. There's an interim step, right? So Claire's story was missing some part here, right? Interim step, where the ESB functioned with just the three heads of the market bodies. I think that was the end of 2022, which would be consistent, by the way, with what I've just read, where those communiques came out around the end of 2022. There was a shift and we moved from having an independent chair and deputy chair to the three of us, but we continued with a fairly extensive policy program of work for a period of time before we were refocused as the Energy Advisory Panel. All right, so we know here that Claire Savage's tale is misleading. It's factually incorrect. The times don't add up. The dates don't make sense. And we know because Ms. Collier here has intervened to correct her and say, wait, there's an interim step. We actually did have resources and we were doing serious policy development work for a step between, all right, independently, just us three market body heads. And then a little bit later, 6 months later or so, something happened and ministers decided to change the format and go to the Energy Advisory Panel. That, of course, is wrong. That is wrong. Anna Collier has given the date wrong again, all right? She said it was the end of 2022, or so she thinks, okay? Let's be super generous and say that she just forgot. She had a hazy memory, all right? But actually, that was not the date at all, all right? And we know that's not the date because I am looking at here a nice press release from the Honourable Angus Taylor MP, Minister in the previous government, from 29th of October 2021 about leadership changes at the Energy Security Board. All right, and in this press release, he basically thanks Dr. Kerry Schott, who is the independent chair, and acknowledges her stepping out of that role, and it says there will be a new chair, quoting now, the new chair will be Ms. Anna Collier, who is also chair of the Australian Energy Market Commission. Ms. Collier will lead the board as it restructures and takes on responsibility for implementing aspects of the energy market reforms agreed to by ministers. Anna Collier's recollection, to correct Claire Savage's recollection, which was about 6 months out, is a full year out. The Energy Security Board was just the three market body heads, whose resignations I have all called for a year and 6 months or so before this flip occurred, where it suddenly became the Energy Advisory Panel. Super secret, purely confidential, advice giving only, no terms of reference provided, no charter, no transparency. All right? And so we know we've found the point here when they can't get their story straight. This is the point that we need to unpack to figure out exactly what has happened. How is this become explainable? How do we make sense of this? Why did this organisation that was proper, did have terms of reference, was transparent, had a website, produced lots of literature, produced lots of policy work, suddenly disappear and suddenly get morphed into this thing that I'm describing, the EAP, as more or less a secret earpiece straight to ministers. So these guys are controlled improperly and start behaving weirdly. And again, before I tell the full story or recount the telling of that story that is perfect, that tells that story absolutely the right way, it's necessary to go to Senator Grogan, just my favourite senator for all these purposes, just once more. And she says, sort of after this description from Anna Collier, so was it essentially a useful shift as the environment changed? The job of work was completed, and therefore you moved to more of a coordinating scenario. Would that be correct? Right? Now, even Ms. Claire Savage doesn't acknowledge that is correct, right? Again, poor Grogan is trying to reach out and make this sound innocent and make it sound all proper, and it's anything but, right? So probably the best way to describe it, I'm just going to read this. It's so important to get the way that these market body heads are trying to describe this story, which is so far from the truth, right? All right, probably the best way to describe it is that in May 2023, energy ministers made a deliberate decision to refocus the ESB, and they agreed the National Energy Transformation Program, again, date's wrong, didn't happen then, and to see senior officials from the various jurisdictions drive the policy work through working groups with the ESB members and now the EAP members coordinating advice in that context rather than being drivers of the work. Okay, that's the way they've tried to fluff that up there. Now, this idea of Senator Grogan's it's so funny because if she described that, if we'd got the right story the first time from Anna Collier, that description could have been seen as sort of okay because there was a shift in the work from Angus Campbell's, all right? When Angus Campbell actually said, okay, we can thank you, Kerry Schott, and the other independent chair, David Swift, for their great work. Now we can move on. It says, at that point, there was an implementation phase shift, if you like, and he says, and I quote, pivoting the Energy Security Board to implementing the post-2025 market design project will ensure energy markets remain secure, reliable, etc. All right, so there was basically... and again as well, the recommendations for reform delivered by the ESP include a critical proposal for the capacity mechanism representing a major milestone in progressing a fit-for-purpose market design. So at that point, a year earlier, if only you got the right answer from Anna Collier, this description from Senator Grogan would have been kind of spot on. But no, the market bodies carried on trying to advance this work for another full year and 6 months in independent capacity, without the independent chairs there. And that is what they cannot give a straight story about when asked by this Senate committee. So now, why not? Now, the real story. Let me just check my notes and see whether I've missed anything here. No, I think it's okay. We can move on. Let's go to the real story, and I'm going to read from Renew Economy. Renew Economy is an online magazine that is very pro-renewables. It is the kind of industry mag, right? And there's an article here by Giles Parkinson from the 1st of March, right? This is late, but in that window, all right, prior to May 2023, so it's about March, all right? And this is good journalism because it tells the story better than I can. I'm going to read a whole bunch of it because it just tells you what you need to hear about who and why and what actually happened in this transition between the legit ESB and the secret EAP straight to ministers that has no transparency and accountability whatsoever, right? The headline is, humiliated ESB reacts badly to its policy rejections. Industry wants it shut down. All right, that's the headline. You can see where this is going. Right, the Energy Security Board, the additional regulatory body recommended by Alan Finkel and put in place by then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Josh Frydenberg, seemed like a good idea at the time. Right, a meeting of the brightest minds from the country's leading institutions. What could possibly go wrong? But it hasn't worked out quite as planned. It has seen as a dead weight on the green energy transition. Many in the industry have had enough and now want it to be gone. The ESB is led by the top people in the country's key institutions, the head of the market operator, the head of the market commission, which sets the rules, and the head of the market regulator. It's not so much the people involved that has divided the industry. What has graded is the nature of the body itself and its pursuit of policies that have appalled those seeking to accelerate rather than slow the green energy transition. At the two most recent meetings of state and federal energy ministers, the ESB has suffered humiliating rejections of two of the most fundamental pieces of Australia's green energy transition: the design of so-called capacity markets and the creating of a new formula to solve grid congestion. On both occasions, it has been slapped down by the industry and by state and federal energy ministers who accuse it of ideological pursuits and being locked in the thrall of the legacy fossil fuel industry. It has already been relegated by ministers to an advisory role. By the way, this is kind of news to me. This is not obvious from the communiques. On both these new key policy streams, and confidence in its ability to produce a fit-for-purpose rewrite of the market rules is at an all-time low. The industry wants it disbanded, and many state ministers appear to agree with that idea. Let's just pause on this incredible commentary from the industry rag itself, the industry magazine. What's happened here is the ESB, the energy security body, in that 18 months or so, when they had just the supposedly independent market heads, there was no sort of independent hand, the independent chairs, right? Just these three guys are trying to develop, and they have the resources to develop, and they're running consultation process to develop some independent, proper policy advice, all right, to ensure that we do get a least cost energy transition. All right, now, this has basically been shouted down by industry. All right, now, the advice that the independent market body heads came up with, all right, capacity markets and things to solve grid congestion. And in fact, you'll see one of them is called locational marginal pricing, and another one is called a sort of a capacity mechanism, and there's a few other names for different things, transmission, access, priority things as well, all right? There's a few other different initiatives. Again, they did lots of work, they had a secretary, they were consulting widely, doing lots of things. Basically, the thrust, if I were to kind of simplify these, is that they acknowledged that renewable energy, wind and solar, had a tendency to turn up at uncontrollable times and places, and that introduced certain costs to the grid. Congestion, all right, turning up at places where it wasn't convenient, not being available at times when you kind of did need the electricity. And so these independent market body heads acting now, and I think what we can now say is the last point when they were having some kind of independence, were suggesting that there is something we have to do. We need to allow some of the costs of the complexity and inconvenience of these generators turning up at times and places that are not perfectly convenient. Some of those costs have to be exposed to those generators. And there has to be some additional benefits and incentives of people that make up and fill the gap, that turn up at the other times that we actually require to ensure reliability. I think everyone in the ESB has more rosy glasses on about the renewable energy transition than they should. But here they are, they're coming up with things that are at least directionally correct. They're sensible, like straight from engineering realities, is that you need to be able to kind of manage the inconvenience of these things turning up at uncontrollable and potentially difficult times and places in the market, right? Previously, you could switch on power sources when and where you wanted, and locate them more or less where you knew and you already built your hard points in the grid. Not so. And so this has been, however, sensible advice, directionally correct. I haven't done a deep dive. Directionally correct, sensible advice for doing the least cost energy pathway with renewables is being shouted down, absolutely furiously shouted down by the energy industry, by the renewable energy developers themselves. And I'll get to this in detail more, with apparently the support of the ministers. This is the story that you have to hear. How did we end up with these market body heads just in the thrall of government? Well, they were humiliated. Their independent policy advice was rejected, right? Let's continue on, because this just needs to be told, right? The issue has erupted again following media reports from an infrastructure conference in Sydney this week. The head of the Australian Energy Regulator, Claire Savage, an influential and powerful figure when Angus Taylor was in the office of Energy Minister, reportedly warned that the grid would have to be rebuilt twice if the congestion rules were not managed properly. Quoting, if we don't get it right, the costs could be higher and the benefits of renewables and storage not realised. Worst case, we rebuild the grid twice, she said, according to the AFR. And me thinking out loud, oh, where is this Claire Savage gone? The one that we now have kind of, I think, misleading Parliament to protect the narrative of the government ministers that shut her down, right? Continuing to quote, Kerry Schott, the former ESB chair and now board member of AGL, was also critical of the minister's decision to dump the locational marginal pricing formula pushed by the ESP, and reportedly accused the wind and solar project developers of focusing on building and selling projects as quickly as possible, but not connecting them. Some in the industry are aghast, with one suggesting the Schott comment was ridiculous because, if reported correctly, it showed no understanding of how the market works. All right, I'm going to start skipping little bits and pieces here. All right, all right, there is a desperate need to streamline, reform, and modernise our energy market bodies, said John Grimes, the head of the Smart Energy Council, which has been one of the strongest opponents of the contested policy. All right. And he was critical of Savage's role as a policy advocate rather than a regulator. And quoting John Grimes, the Australian Energy Regulator should focus on regulating the energy market and not be distracted from that critical role, he said in a statement to Renew Economy. Quoting again, policymakers should be allowed to focus on policy matters and should be resourced properly to do that job. Energy market bodies that have no clear role, like the Energy Security Board, should be abolished. Stephanie Bashir from Nexa Advisory, which has led some of the campaigns against the ESB's signature policy proposals, says there is broad agreement that the ESB role is now redundant and the current governance arrangements are no longer fit for purpose. Quote, it should be wound up, Bashir says. Quote, the closed culture is hindering progress on customer-focused outcomes and meeting our emissions reductions goals. Clarity of the roles of the AER, AMC and AEMO is urgently needed to ensure accountability, coordination and long-term certainty. This is profound, all right? Again, I read so much of this because I could not tell the story better myself. There's a scene in this movie, right? The carry-on action thriller, right? Like where the guy who means well has been hijacked. He's got the earpiece in his ear from the nasty spy enforcer dude who's going to kill his pregnant girlfriend, right? He's trying desperately to find ways to get messages out, to get to alert someone else without getting his girlfriend killed. And at one point he does. He writes on the boarding pass of a customer whose baggage is inspecting in a sort of special pen that you can't see until you shine a special light on it. Said, oh, I think there's this person located in this area. They're from here. There's an active threat. Please protect my girlfriend. Get her. So he writes this sort of secret message and tries to get this out and passes it to his colleague who kind of is able to know. Anyway, the nasty enforcer spy dude gets wind of it and intercepts the carrier of the message, kills him, and takes the message away so it doesn't reach authorities and alarm is not raised. And this is again, it's sort of weird, but it's just this perfect analogy for what's happened in this case, because the Energy Security Board was trying to get out an important key message. They had a message which was directionally correct, which is that open slather, allowing every renewable energy developer to just set up shop wherever they wanted without any of the costs and difficulties being exposed to them, so they choose the least inconvenient places to add to the grid and are incentivized to provide as much firming capacity themselves. Without that, we will have a much, 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 much higher energy cost. They were trying to get a sensible message out. They were trying to reach out. And what happened? Well, later on, the messenger was killed. The messenger was executed. That's what happened, all right? And that's what the story was, basically on May 19th, and basically not fit for purpose, right? Again, reading another Renew Economy article here. After Coalkeeper and Solar Stopper, Energy Ministers axe ESB. And there's this brilliant article that goes on to crow about how wonderful it is that the ESB, which everyone was so frustrated by, in the industry at least, had been got rid of, right? And so that's what happened. I think we have, in these attempted market reforms, the last image of true independence And there was a directionally correct message they were trying to get out, that this energy transition, if you rush it, if you make it open slather, if you don't manage the costs and incentivize the right reliability mechanism, if you're not careful, you'll stuff this up and it will cost a whole heap more and reliability will be compromised. That was a key message they wanted to get out. The messenger was killed so that the message was intercepted and never saw the light of day. There's a little bit more color that needs to be filled in. Again, I'm sorry this is a long story, but you just have to tell this, right? This has to be known, all right? Another article, all right, that paints the picture of the relevant characters in this scene. On 9th of December 2022, again, this is just after another energy ministers meeting, all right? Renew Economy reports, coal keeper killed off as Labor states embrace Matt Kean's auction and underwriting plan. Okay. All right, and they go on to say that, look now, coal keeper is dead, hailed the Queensland Energy Minister, Mick de Brenny. He's now been voted out of office. All right, and quoting here as well, I think it's still Nick de Brenny, right? So, national energy ministers have agreed to more historic progress to meeting long-term reforms that will deliver this nation's domestic energy independence and sovereign capability over foreign supply chains, he wrote on LinkedIn, which is all kind of nonsense given that all our renewables come from China anyway. And Renew Economy writes, okay, the irony is that what federal and all the Labor states have chosen to do in creating a capacity investment scheme is to follow a blueprint laid out in another coalition government, this time in New South Wales, and painstakingly put together by that state's energy minister, Matt Kean, and his team. This is the same Matt Kean whose resignation I have called for because he was in Parliament on November the 4th describing exactly incorrectly what the ISP actually does, assuming that the ISP does tests and compares to other alternative energy sources, which it does not. He's, I think, misled Parliament so badly and has completely misrepresented what the ISP does so badly, it's egregious. But now here we get the next level of how diabolical this misunderstanding could be. If this is the guy that back then had the same misunderstanding that renewables are cheaper, right? Renewables are cheaper because the experts tell us so, because the experts say that, it's the least cost way, ignoring all the fine print, and says they haven't determined that at all adequately as well. If this is the guy that now is being given the crown as sort of, the master of the blueprint that will replace the actual independent experts' advice, which was to do different systems that would have exposed the renewable energy industry to some of the costs they were introducing to the system, you can see how absolutely disastrous the mess that we are in really is. This is absolutely appalling. If he had that misunderstanding, was able to carry the whole of the Energy Ministerial Council on that misunderstanding of what the ISP proved and quash the independent advice of the head of the market operator, who in his proper body, the ESB, which still sort of did have terms and reference and a legitimate policy development authority, was trying to say, no, guys, we need to expose the renewable market to some of the costs they introduce to do it efficiently. If open slather subsidies to underwrite renewables being built wherever and whenever they want, which is what Matt Kean's proposal essentially has done, was done in favour of that, there is just no understating how badly we've been misled, how far up the garden path we've actually come. Again, it's important the actors, I'm sorry this is a really long one, but it has to be spelt out, where these actors sort of came from, what actually happened here. The Smart Energy Council is front and centre of this. Now, the Smart Energy Council, this is the group, by the way, that all through 2024 provided the most absolutely fact-free bit of propaganda for the Labor government in saying that the coalition's nuclear plan would probably only produce 4% of our electricity requirements. And this was done based on ignoring the capacity factors and treating storage as an actual generator of electricity. An absolutely appalling calculation, completely using the wrong units and making the wrong comparison, was recycled by the Labor Party again and again and again. So they're in my bad books for providing this absolutely atrocious, appalling disregard for the truth and honesty to provide talking points for the Labor Party that were used and rehearsed all through 2024. But in 2023, all right, 2023, the Smart Energy Council, they list, we advocate for our members and for smarter energy policy. Look at the members, there's lots of them, lots of big solar and battery players in particular. But how we're driving for change. 2023, all right, on their own website, it says, 2023 achievements oversaw the demise of the Energy Security Board. It's their own words, like they're not fooling around. They were the ones who are taking credit for having crushed the Energy Security Board, got the ministers to axe it and abandon those plausibly sensible, directionally correct at least, reforms that they were providing, all right, and turned them, I think, into these totally just at the foot of the ministerial table, unaccountable, advice-only group, right? Get this, in the Smart Energy Council's submission summary, right, their own submission summary, 9th of January 2023, the Energy Security Board Transmission Access Reform, right? This is one of the ESB's proposals, all right, to kind of manage transmission access and manage congestion in a somewhat sensible, I think, I haven't checked it in detail, somewhat sensible direction, right? Okay. The Smart Energy Council included in their submission, right? So the Smart Energy Council, we are the peak independent body for Australia's smart energy industry, representing et cetera, right? So the Smart Energy Council is fundamentally opposed to locational marginal pricing. Australia will not achieve 82% renewables by 2030 with locational margin pricing. It's a recipe for roadblocks in an action on renewables and climate change, all right? What else do they go? As with the much-hated congestion management mechanism proposed by the Energy Security Board, the Energy Security Board has for 4 years continued to pitch a version of locational marginal pricing and the congestion management mechanism, knowing there is no consensus on the approach and knowing that it will produce no outcomes. This approach has led to genuine questions about the value of maintaining the Energy Security Board. All right, imagine the balls you need to just basically write brazenly to this own board itself in their submission to their things that they do have a proper mandate to be, doing this policy development work for. We are so dislike what you're advising, that you're persistently advising that we think that you should be abolished, right? And then crow later after the fact that you did succeed in getting that organisation abolished. That is what has happened. It is the industry that has been able to secure the demise of the Energy Security Board with any kind of independence. And they had to do that to kill the messenger, to intercept the message that there was going to be some tough stuff ahead, some serious costs in trying to advance this renewable energy pathway. They succeeded in killing that messenger. And by the way, who are the people who are involved in Smart Energy Council? They have a board. Stephanie Bashir, I think might be currently on the board, but certainly Simon Holmes-A-Court was on the board at the time of these reforms being, of these submissions and these discussions being underway. All right, and so I'm just going to see whether I can quickly plug in my camera. I'll just try to race through and get this done. Sorry again for this taking a while. And so we have now, I think, quite clearly this impression. Nexter Advisory, so Simon Holmes-A-Court was on the board. Nexter Advisory is a group that is also been confirmed to have received some funding from Mike Cannon-Brookes. This is on June 27th, 2024, that there was a column in Rear Window on the AFR. Money from Mike Cannon-Brookes has so much energy. Explaining that Stephanie Bashir, and by the way, confirmed Cannon-Brookes charity financially backed some of my work in finding solutions that could be available to the New South Wales government on progressing its renewable energy transition. Again, the New South Wales government, which was adopted wholeheartedly, like Matt Keane, all right, who's got the wrong idea about what the ISP shows. His proposal for essentially open-ended subsidies for renewable energies was preferred and used to basically crush the suggestions from the independent market body heads. All right, so again, all these familiar players that turn up in this kind of space here, I think it's important to know. So final bits of mechanics, just to, I think, put the nail in the coffin, like how this secret earpiece has actually been used and how it's operated. There's another document that has been produced, all right? And again, this is just such an absolutely shocking breach of trust, huge breach of trust, in my opinion. The energy ministers, all right, they issued new statements of role and statements of expectation to all of the market bodies. And this was done back in August 2022. So this is fairly new in their government, right? And this was the start, I think, of their movement towards basically crushing the independence of these groups and putting them squarely under the thumb of the ministers, all right? And so you have these statements of roles. I'm going to read from AEMOs, but there's equivalent ones for the Energy Market Commission and Energy Regulator. They're called statements of expectations. But they basically give all these statements that make it really clear that they report to ministers, that ministers sort of, are the ones that are directly in charge. So there's statements on financial reporting. Energy ministers also expect AEMO to report to them every 6 months, all right, on progress against its annual work plan, budget, key priorities, etc. Energy ministers, all right, relationships with energy ministers, all right. Energy ministers expect AEMO will support them by providing high quality and evidence-based advice on developing issues relevant to energy ministers' priorities and other issues as requested by the energy ministers. Like, this is advice that you put in comes in like secretaries' job descriptions, right? Like, and any other advice that we seem fit at the time, any other priorities that we have from day to day. This is not consistent with independent statutory organisations that have a particular purpose that stands independently from government, all right? And so there's just all these sort of things. And also, of course, again, critical thing, the energy ministers should not be instructing the market bodies into how they do their job. But here it says the opposite, right? So based on the ESB's assessment or any other matter as agreed by the energy ministers may decide to provide AEMO with feedback on their performance, all right? Again, in this statement of role, all right? Okay, now there's more and more language in here, all right, that is key. And one of the ones I pick up, right, is there's actually in the National Transmission Planner section of this, all right? So to carry out this role by promoting efficient transmission, long-term investments, blah, 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 that meet policy objectives, all right? Again, I think that distinction here between policy objectives and the national electricity objectives has been breached in this document. That's one statement. But there's a lot more language as well, which refers to another document, right? So we'll support, expectations of AEMO, recognising that AEMO plays an important role, etc., etc. Energy ministers expect AEMO to support through its work the achievement of the outcomes and objectives of the energy ministers' SEP. That's a strategic energy plan, all right? And so energy ministers expect AEMO through its work and governance arrangements will prioritise the achievements of the SEP outcomes and its objectives, all right? Energy ministers will expect AEMO will otherwise seek to prioritise its tasks with regard to the SEP and according to AEMO's energy resource and capacity, right? So there's a lot of reference to the SEP, Strategic Energy Plan, in this document. What's the SEP, you might ask? It's something that predates the Labor government, and it's actually a reasonably sensible document in that it qualifies as though it's something like that high-level direction-setting objectives, which I characterise the national electricity objectives to almost still be, right? So it says things like affordable energy and satisfied customers, secure electricity and gas systems, reliable and low emissions electricity and gas supply, all right? Efficient and timely investments in networks, strong but agile governments. These are things that are high-level values, not too specific, not bedded down in the detail, not specifying every action and amount of technology in every state by each time. It's things that should be values that should be upheld. But there's also a key statement here in this statement of role, which I think just again helps draw critical connections. Should energy ministers deem it necessary to replace or amend the SEP or equivalent document, AEMO is expected to continue to self-assess, report on, and receive feedback on its performance against the goals and objectives of such a document. Just put a pin in that. The energy ministers, if they think that it needs to be replaced, amend SEP or equivalent document, then they'll do that, and AEMO should carry on, right? So this whole document is now so completely weirdly contradicted and not really It makes no sense. It claims to be doing best practice by setting these new statements of role. But the statements of role were suggested by the Vertigan Review ages back, even predated Finkel. And basically the statements of role was meant to be for AEMO specifically to make sure they didn't expand into a whole bunch of policy development work where they didn't really belong. And give clarity about that. And so you can see in the reviews of the ESB as well, like, and other recommendations, this sort of stuff it's been totally taken in a different direction to make it now AEMO's job and everyone's job and the ESB's job, but the ESB doesn't exist anymore. It's the EAP, but there's no terms of reference. It's still this kind of document. Like it's meant to be consistent with the overall guiding documents that are in place, like the Australian Energy Marketplace Agreement, right? That is the one that really sets out the nature of these three different market bodies and how they report to and what they do. AEMO is mentioned twice in that document. There is nothing there that says that it will report directly to ministers. All this ministerial reporting stuff is totally new. That is not how the AEMO was initially set up. And also there's a health of the NEM report that's meant to be done, and that's how the accountability would be done through this statement of role. That report was done once immediately after the statement of role was adopted in late 2022 and not done since, not carried on. So this statement of role is relying on a whole bunch of seemingly defunct or outdated practices. The ESB doesn't exist. The statement of strategic energy policies was last government's thing. That doesn't seem like what the current government today is that closely following. How do we make sense of this? All right. And again, there is just an absolutely incredible revelation that came in the dissenting report to the latest Senate inquiry, right? The Energy Planning Regulation Inquiry. In it, the dissenting report, right? So recommendation 2 of this report, this final report, by the way, was that they should go and update the Strategic Energy Plan. All right. So this is, that's recommended. The committee recommends the Energy and Climate Ministerial Council develop and publish an updated Strategic Energy Plan, because it was clear this was the previous government's thing. It didn't seem to fit with what was happening with the ESB and the ESB wasn't there anymore, all right? They also recommended, by the way, the terms of reference for the EAP and operating charter made available, because that hadn't yet been done, all right? But in the dissenting report, an absolutely key admission is made, all right? Labor senators do not support the development of an updated strategic energy plan by ECMC. They don't want to do that. Labor doesn't want to do a new update to the strategic energy plan. But why not? This is the bombshell. It is the Labor senators' understanding that the ISP in effect serves as a strategic energy plan. So to develop another one would again be duplicative and wasteful. So here you have it, a perfectly closed loop. A tightly circular logic. And this explains literally why we do have this energy advisory panel and the ESB that's kind of has no, not the ESB, it's become the EAP, which has no terms of reference, but they're definitely beholden to report to ministers all the time, and they sort of have this statement of roles which sort of refers to it, but it's out of there. The government thinks that this is all fine. The government thinks this is all fine because they actually intend that they are getting the market bodies to just implement the integrated system plan, which is the plan that includes every single bit of every government policy. Not the high-level objectives. In fact, we've done damage and violence to the enforcement of high-level objectives because we have made every thought bubble and brain fart from every level of government an accomplished fact in our most important planning document. It's crystal clear. Like, this is not a conspiracy. This is what the Labor senators say they are trying to do. They say that they assume that the ISP is the strategic energy plan, and that they have said very clearly in this statement of roles that they are asking all the market bodies to bring about that plan. The conversion of these market bodies, and the ISP in particular, from a supposedly independent technical assessment of anything and into a pure protection racket that is simply advancing the interests of what ministers think is the best policy, with no attempt to provide any critical advice, is perfectly complete and clear. There is just no doubt about the fact that that has happened. And I think it's an utter disaster, an absolute disaster. And the least I can ask for is Daniel Westerman's resignation. And I honestly think as well, for all the other market body heads, that I have already called for their resignations. And I think this adds, if you like, an extra layer of reinforcement. Like, they should have resigned at the points when it started to become clear that their ability to do their independent job was being compromised by this ministerial council giving them inappropriate instructions. They should have realised that. They absolutely should have realised that, and that was the right point of time to resign. Maybe it was in August when the statements of role were actually issued, because they don't look very hunky-dory to me. Or maybe it was in December when they crushed their advice, or maybe it was in May, right, when they finally said, you know what, you can just become this totally private advice organisation that has no secretary, no independence, we're going to kill your signature proposals. Maybe it was then, but whatever point, I'm late calling for the resignations. You guys should have resigned far, far earlier than this, because there is no walking back from the evidence that is now in the public arena on this. All right, and so poor Daniel Westerman, I'm going to conclude this by sort of just going over, I think, nails in the coffin of how he now looks, about how his role, I think, his statements are utterly untenable, all right? Before the Senate inquiry, again on the 5th of December, he describes the different accountability mechanisms when challenged again by my hero, Senator Grogan, who's asked, how do you preserve and safeguard your independence? And Mr. Westerman goes on and describes what I would describe as a kind of patchwork version of a collage of 3 different layers of accountability and independence, right? It's an independent company and it's accountability through corporate governance laws. There's truth in that, right? All right, the directors are accountable under the Corporations Act. There is truth in that, all right? And the second is we have conferred functions under the National Electricity Rules and Regulations, all right? And the board of directors are responsible for ensuring all those discharged. Now, there's truth in that too. And the third idea is that we're accountable to energy ministers through the Ministerial Council, where I appear and represent AEMO on a range of functions that we perform. This is the one that there is not really truth behind. All right. What is described as a collage should in fact be a chain of command. All right. He should sit safely underneath his board of directors, and they should protect him from the meddling of ministers. He reports to them. They are responsible for ensuring the statutory obligations, all right, of the company are fulfilled. Otherwise, they're in breach of their directors' duties. All right. And they need to ensure and oversee him doing his job to do the same. So when he walks into the Ministerial Council to give advice, he should be absolutely confident, sitting pretty, that no advice needs to flow the other way. Ministers can't fire him. They can't tell him what to do, right? His priority is to discharge the obligations, the national and statutory obligations, and his board will oversee that he does that right. But instead, it seems that he has created and essentially indulged and strengthened this tie directly to the Ministerial Council. And in fact, he goes on, right, okay, so to describe sort of, we have to achieve these overarching objectives, national electricity energy objective, obviously best in the long-term interest of consumers, etc. All right, so he's claiming that we have to do these statutory obligations, all right? And so Senator Grogan, again, my hero, you did this just so perfectly. So you're accountable to ministers from each state and federal minister, even though there's been some commentary about you not being directly accountable to Parliament. Is that correct, right? And he says, and this is the wrong answer, our accountability is discharged through the Ministerial Council I attend. That's, so far as I can tell, wrong. That is him submitting to the earpiece. If you look at the actual statutory documents, there is nothing in the Energy Market Agreement, all right, in particular, that actually says that he should be reporting directly to the ministers. The board should be that intermediate layer, all right? And again, Senator Grogan, all right, after the end of that comment, all right, thank you, of course, and each of those ministers is then accountable to a range of parliaments around the country. Again, this is wrong, flat out wrong, because the Energy Ministerial Council, there are no minutes kept, no record of how any of those ministers actually vote, what they support, what they don't support in that Ministerial Council. That is totally confidential. National Cabinet confidentiality. All right, so none of the other parliaments can ask what those ministers were doing and how they were representing their states in that body. There is zero transparency, zero accountability back to the parliaments in that respect. And no voters, of course, can petition their parliamentarians to go and ask the minister what they do. That accountability mechanism does not exist. Thank you, Senator Grogan, for spelling it out so perfectly. The accountability mechanism that Daniel Westerman has chosen to emphasise as being one the buck stops at is not the correct mechanism at all. All right? And there is this tragic conclusion to the whole day, all right, where I think that it's ventured by the chair, all right? The chair, David Van, goes on to say, in concluding remarks, basically, for the whole committee inquiry that he's run, part of the challenge for AEMOs is not a lot of accountability between you and other organisations, all right? And he goes on and expands on that a little bit. And Westerman says, I think we'll have to agree to disagree on a couple of fronts, on accountability, the framework. And also, right, and he goes on. And this is worth watching, right, because I actually feel sorry for Daniel Westerman at this point, right? He says, and he puts his hand on his heart as he says this, he says, definitely sincere, unquestionably sincere, I feel, and our board feels, extremely accountable. And that's the problem. It's that he sees himself and his board together in the same place, which they should not be. Accountable, and it's so clear that he is feeling the pressure of being accountable to ministers. Ministers directly. We have so much evidence now about how directly that connection has been made, which is improper. And it's so clear that in doing so and accepting the minister's directives and including making the 82% binding at the department, which is the minister's department's request, binding in all scenarios, which they didn't have to do and they weren't planning on doing. There is just no doubt, absolutely no doubt that the independence, the credibility of the organisation of AEMO has been fatally compromised by this, by the heads of the market bodies basically making themselves totally beholden to and directly accountable to the wishes and the wills of the ministers. This is an unmitigated disaster. I cannot emphasise how serious this is. There must be some kind of royal commission to get to the bottom of how this rot started and how bad it has got. The ISP, the Integrated System Plan, cannot be used for anything, to prove anything. If you want to refer to it as proof that renewables are cheapest at a barbecue amongst friends, then go ahead. You're wrong and silly. It doesn't prove that at all, but go ahead. But if you are a company director and have any role in any of your investments in any other companies that refer to the ISP as being some kind of reference point, be warned now. Back away. The ISP's independence is fatally and horrendously compromised. The resignations should have come a long time ago. The investigations should still be coming. Walk away from anything that the ISP has done to support any argument that you make or any investment decisions or any other function that you make in any government, public policy, any role that you might have. The ISP is dead. It needs to be buried. This one will not work. The institutions need to recover, but absolutely what's happened here requires all the heads of those market bodies resign before we can hope to restore trust in the institutions in the future. Thank you everyone for watching. Share this if you think it's important. I certainly think it is. Thank you for the support you've given me. And I hope that we can move forward to have a civil evidence-based debate that doesn't simply refer to blind trust in experts whose trust has been so badly abused. Thanks very much.